Can rich people go to heaven? Mark chapter 10 seems to suggest no. In fact, in verse 23, when after Jesus has sent away the rich young ruler, he says how hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of God. And Jesus says in verse 24, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who's rich to enter the kingdom of God. We've heard that verse before. It's impossible for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Like, it just doesn't fit. Does that mean it's impossible for a rich person to enter heaven? We need to be faithful to the text in our answer. So we can't just say, well, obviously Jesus can't be saying that because maybe Jesus is. Maybe Jesus has a radical message for us. But what I think the point of this passage is can be found in verse 27. So let's think about the whole overview of what happens here. So he sends the rich young ruler away because the rich young ruler is not willing to give up his possessions. And then Jesus says it's very difficult for the rich to enter the kingdom of God. And the disciples, it says in verse 24, were amazed at these words. So they're like, whoa, the rich people can't enter heaven. In fact, in verse 26, they say to each other, who can be saved then? So what I think Jesus is responding to is their presupposition that in order to be saved, you have to be rich. And that makes sense in the Jewish times, because in the Jewish times, if you were a priest, or I guess a member of the Pharisees or the Sadducees, those people were the people who were entering heaven. They were the ones who were following the law to the T. And they were the ones who were wealthy compared to the rest of the Israelites. So the disciples' mind, they said, if they can't even get in, they who are rich and following the law, how could we get in? And everything boils down to verse 27. Jesus says, with man, this is impossible, but not with God. With man, it's impossible for a rich man to get into heaven, but it's also impossible for a poor person to get into heaven because the point is that salvation is not dependent on man. That's why when Jesus says, with man, this is impossible, but not with God, he's meaning that it doesn't matter if you're rich, it doesn't matter if you're poor. I don't want to say that what Jesus says about the rich person doesn't matter. Clearly, Jesus is saying it's more difficult to enter the kingdom of heaven if you're rich. But that's not the whole point of what he's trying to say. What he's trying to say is if you're rich or if you're poor, it's really hard if you're rich. It's still difficult if you're poor, according to the disciples. The point is that everything comes from God. And we're thankful for that. We're thankful that we don't get in based on wealth merits. That's not what the kingdom of God is all about. The kingdom of God is God, Jesus, accepting everybody into the kingdom, regardless of if you are the top of the chain or if you're an outcast. And that's the beauty of the gospel.